welcome to our brand new series, The American Founding, with Dr. Jay Cost, sponsored by the Institute for Faith and Freedom at Grove City College. My name is Scott Cross, and I'm a fellow with the Institute for Faith and Freedom, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our host tonight, Dr. Jay Cost. Dr. Jay Cost is a Gerald F. Ford Senior Non-Residential Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a visiting scholar at the Institute for Faith and Freedom. He's the author of 5 books, most recently, Democracy or Republic, The People in the Constitution. And his book, forthcoming from the University of Kansas, is an examination of the Jeffersonian Republican Party. Dr. Cost received his PhD from the University of Virginia. He lives in Zelienople with his wife and 2 kids, and one very spoiled cat who may make an appearance tonight. Tonight, Dr. Cost will be speaking on In Defense of the Founding. Following tonight's talk, there will be a brief Q&A, so put any questions you may have in the chat, and Dr. Cost will get to those, as many as he can. And so without further ado, Dr. Cost.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Scott. And thank you to everybody in Grove City land that's watching right now. And we're also doing this simultaneously on X. This is my first attempt at producing a live X, formerly Twitter, video broadcast. I have no idea how it's going to go, to be perfectly honest. I don't usually get nervous about these things, but I've been very nervous about this all day, not because I don't know what I'm talking about, but I don't know what I'm doing with technology. So if any of this is getting out beyond my desk, I'm very, very excited. So Scott, let me just introduce for the people who are watching who are not familiar with Grove City, and talk a little bit about Grove City College. Grove City, I really think Grove City is one of the conservative world's most best kept secrets. And I think it's time that people should know that Grove City College in Western Pennsylvania really ranks among the best colleges and universities, not just in Pennsylvania, but the United States. It emphasizes intellectual, moral, spiritual, social development consistent with commitment to Christian truth. The college advocates individual freedom, personal responsibility, and seeks to preserve America's political, economic, and religious heritage. And I got to tell you, I think the coolest thing about Grove City is it is one of the few remaining truly independent colleges in the nation. It takes no federal funding, which means no student aid, which allows the college to operate free of government interference or political interference. And all this talk the last day or so about people getting government aid, and look what that's in. Grove City gets nothing. They take nothing from government aid. And I've taught up at Grove City for a couple years. It's a fantastic school. So if you're thinking about going to college, or you have a son or daughter or niece or nephew or whatever, take a look at Grove City. And you can learn more about Grove City and the Institute for Faith and Freedom at faithandfreedom.com. So, as Scott indicated, tonight's talk is about why the founding matters, or we might call it also In Defense of the Founding. So what is the founding? That's the first thing I want to talk about. And my sort of vision for this is an informal series of lectures that are kind of programmatic. I'm not just going to be sort of like moving around from place to place, but I really want this to be an opportunity for people who love the Constitution, love America's heritage, to take a really deep dive into the most formative period in the country's history. And when I think of the founding, usually I think about roughly 1776 to 1826. There's a certain poetry there because, of course, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams both died on July 4th, 1826. So there's something to be said for that kind of 50-year period. It's not just the Constitution, although the Constitution's a big part of it. It's also the establishment of the institutions and also the norms that have become essential to what we understand as free government and ordered liberty in the United States of America. One of the really interesting things about the American founding, something that we're going to talk about over the course of this series, is we take it as a singular corpus of this is how this is when we think of the founding, we take it as these traditions, these norms, these institutions. But what's really fascinating, I think, when you dig into it, is that there was a lot of internal division and a lot of differences of opinion. And you could go back even all the way to the debate over revolution itself, loyalists and patriots. John Dickinson, for instance, who ends up being a hugely important contributor to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, he could not bring himself to vote for independence in 1776. He's one of the few loyalists who end up becoming major contributors in the country's political development over the next couple decades. But I think it speaks to this idea that the disagreement between the loyalists and the patriots was often a disagreement about means and not ends. And then we can also look, and we will look at the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalist opponents of the Constitution. Now, many of them had very valid critiques that are worth considering today. And of course, the rise of the first political parties, the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans. In your textbooks, you probably have heard of them as the Democratic Republicans. That is that is a historically inaccurate term. They call themselves Republicans. I usually call them the Jeffersonian Republicans to distinguish them from the party of Abraham Lincoln. But then even later on, you can look at the fight between the Whigs and the Democrats, the battles between Henry Clay and Andrew Jackson, and you can still see the United States working through essential questions that could be considered part of the founding. And what I like to think about the foundings, so what was the outcome? What were they doing? I would say that it was an effort to secure free government in two senses of the word. The first sense is the one that we usually think of. When we think of freedom, we in America and the modern world even think of personal liberty, freedom from restraint. We think of the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, and the founders definitely thought of things that way. There's no doubt about that. Jefferson was very clear in the Declaration of Independence that the purpose of the revolution was to secure our rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But there's a more ancient concept of freedom embedded in the founding, which goes back to classical antiquity and even to ancient Greece, this idea of meaningful participation in the lawmaking process. An individual is free because he or she participates in the writing of the laws that he or she must obey. So those are the two senses of freedom. And I should add, one of the things that makes the founding so fascinating is the Americans were really flying by the seat of their pants, as we'll see. There was nothing like this happening in the world, in the West at this time. And even the ancient analogs, if you look at ancient Rome and ancient Greece, or maybe more recent ones like Renaissance Florence, is nothing compared to the relatively rowdy democratic republic that they were looking to put together. And the Constitution, of course, is the pivot point of this story. Everything kind of hinges on the Constitution. Maybe a better way to think of the Constitution is the keystone of the American founding. It is the thing that holds everything together, and it what places everything else in its place. But like I said, there were big changes afterwards. And there's also one of the things I think you'll find really interesting is talking about the people who lost in this debate. For instance, one of the people that I want to talk about is John Adams and his political thought. John Adams was widely misunderstood, and he was, frankly, widely disliked among his contemporaries. And he had views today that we would consider aristocratic or oligarchic, but that were honest efforts to try and realize a stable democratic republic. There's views like that. There's also similar views from people like Gouverneur Morris. And that is a really fascinating aspect of this, I think, is looking at individuals who had ideas and those ideas didn't really win the day. So why is this worth our while? Now, obviously, if you're here tonight and watching this, or later on when it's on the podcast, I mean, you probably you've been sold a little bit. But I think it's still worth mentioning, and it's going to sort of lead into the main thing that I want to talk about tonight. But first, I mean, the obvious reason, and this is worthwhile, is that it's intrinsically valuable. It's a good thing. It was a good event in the history of the world. The United States founding represents the creation of the first stable, durable republic. And it was shockingly democratic for its time. I think it's easy for us in the modern 21st century to look back and say, well, it's not that democratic. It's just propertied white men, which is true. But when you think about where political participation was in the rest of the world, and who actually got to participate in politics, this was a shockingly democratic development. So it's just intrinsically interesting. It's also important, I think, instrumentally too. It's an instrumental value. As citizens, we all have an interest in making sure the government is doing right by us. And so we have an interest in knowing how the government is supposed to work so we can judge how it's working today. So there's that as well. But what I want to talk about tonight and this idea of why the founding needs to be defended. And I want to suggest that the founding requires a constant intellectual defense. Not an angry one or not one that is rooted in the rise of people who have disagreements with the founding, but a cheerful defense and an understanding that to be a conservative in the sense of supporting the American founding requires you to cheerfully defend it. And so I want to think through exactly what I mean by that. So when we think of the word conservative nowadays, usually we think about the Republican Party, we think about traditional values, we think about economic liberty. But the notion of conservatism from a historical perspective is something that's actually pretty different. And I want to sort of begin here way 100 years before the founding of the United States of America, go back to the 1670s in England during what was known as the Exclusion Crisis. So the issue in the 1670s was that King Charles II had been on the throne for about 15 years. He and his wife, Catherine of Braganza, were not on speaking terms. They had no legitimate children. Charles II had about 24 illegitimate children, if you can believe that, but no legitimate children, which meant that by the 1670s, it was clear that his younger brother, James, the Duke of York, was going to be the next king. Now, the issue and the problem was that James was a Catholic, and England had been for over a century a Protestant nation. Now, there were two factions within English politics that were debating this. The first group became known as the Tories, what we today call the Conservatives. They were conservative, but they were conservative in a medieval or pre-modern sense of the word. Their view was that the established order was divinely established, and that James, as God's anointed, was the one to succeed Charles II. That's sort of a conservatism by recourse to the divine way of being, right? Or what historians have called the great chain of being, this idea that God in his divine omnipotence and providence has seen fit to organize civilization in the way that he has chosen to, and God in his divine omnipotence has chosen James II. The other view became known as the Whig view, and what the Whigs wanted to do was to exclude, hence exclusion crisis, exclude James II from the throne because he was a Catholic, and this was a Protestant nation, right? In other words, the idea is that England as a political community should make this decision for itself, and that the decision about who governs is a decision that is not ordained by God on high, but rather is chosen in some meaningful sense by the political community. And John Locke, the English philosopher, who was highly influential in Jefferson's drafting of the Declaration of Independence, was actually the secretary for the Earl of Shaftesbury, who was one of the key Whig uh, objectors to the Catholic James II. And so, in a lot of respects, the fight between the Whigs and the Tories, at least in the 1670s, and again, when I say Tories and conservatives, I'm not talking about Thatcherite conservatism. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about like early modern Tory conservatism, is really kind of a battle over the question of modernity itself and the question of who governs, and modernity's challenge to the medieval order about the question of who governs. And the reason this is important is because the Americans in the 1670s, 80s, and 90s were from an important perspective, not just a continuation of the Whig tradition, but a real radicalization of the Whig tradition. So, for instance, the Whigs in the 1670s thought that the political community had a right to exclude a Catholic king. The Americans take that to another step. They get rid of the king altogether. So there's a radicalism there. The Constitution also is full of reforms that the Whigs had been calling for. Things, for instance, like regularly updated apportionment for House districts. That was something that the Whigs had wanted to get rid of in the House of Commons because House of Commons seats had been set for centuries and there were things known as rotten boroughs, right? So the Americans, in a lot of ways, are trying to modernize and republicanize the Whig political philosophy. Right. So, in this entire idea here is that and you see this in the Federalist Papers, that the Constitution or that politics can be organized according to rational principles, or political science is what it's called in the Federalist Papers. The founders use that phrase a lot. They use the phrase Federalist Papers. And so to be a constitutionalist, then you really cannot be a Tory in the traditional sense of the word. You can't be a Tory in the 1670 sense. You have to be a Whig. In other words, to be a constitutionalist, to embrace the Constitution, is to make the argument that the Constitution is should be supported and defended because it's a good system of government, not because it's old, not because it was ordained by God, but because it makes sense, right? And indeed, the Constitution itself has that very principle embedded in it. There's a process of amendment, right? It, by its own design, the Constitution is not a sacred document, right? It can be changed. It has been changed. It's been changed 27 times over the years. So the question is, why do we defend it then? And I think the answer to that question really comes in the Declaration itself, right? Where Jefferson he's in the middle of making this high flowing argument, basically declaring that citizens or political communities have a right to revolution. And then he stops and then he says, prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. Prudence, right? And American conservatism is not 17th century Toryism, but as many other people have noted, it's really the politics of prudence. We don't go changing institutions that seem to be working. We don't do that. That doesn't make sense. We recognize and we appreciate the value that institutions provide. And even when they're not working correctly, we move carefully and cautiously, recognizing that oftentimes when you tinker with a fundamental instrument of government, you're going to create circumstances that you completely fail to anticipate. Right. And so for the Americans then, and for American constitutionalists, it's sort of the division line between supporting the revolution, the American Revolution, and then looking on at horror at the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and above all, the Chinese Revolution. That changing fundamental ways of doing things, it can be a very dangerous task, and that what we need to do is we need to appreciate the good things that we have. In other words, now that's not to say that in America in the 21st century, we're fighting like a battle. Constitutionalists are fighting a battle against, 19th century Marxism. I mean, there's Marxism around, right? But what we constantly, as supporters of the Constitution, have to deal with are ideas that earnest and honest people offer that are actually just really, really bad. I mean, that's really the problem. So the government that we as constitutionalists make or defend is that the Constitution is still today the best system of government on the table, right? Of all of the options under consideration, our Constitution is still the best for this particular place and this particular time, right? And I think one of the ways to think about this, and one of the ways I like to think about this, is Benjamin Franklin. On the last day of the Constitutional Convention, September 17th, 1787, when the framers were signing the Declaration, Franklin gave a speech. And I'm going to read a portion of it because it's just really good, but I think it really encapsulates the point that I'm trying to get to. This is Franklin. Franklin says, I doubt too whether any other convention we can obtain may be able to make a better constitution. For when you assemble a number of men to have the advantage of their joint wisdom, you inevitably assemble with these men all their prejudices, their passions, their errors of opinion, their local interests, and their selfish views. From such an assembly can a perfect production be expected, excuse me. Can a perfect production be expected? It therefore astonishes me, sir, to find this system approaching so near to perfection as it does. And I think it will astonish our enemies who are waiting with confidence to hear that our counsels are confounded like those of the builders of Babel, and that our states are on the point of separation, only to meet hereafter for the purpose of cutting one another's throats. Thus, Franklin concludes, I consent, sir, to this Constitution because I expect no better and because I am not sure that it is not the best. That's the argument of the constitutionalist, right? Not that the framers handed down a document from on high by God Almighty, but we support and defend the Constitution because we expect no alternative to be better, and because it's possible that another alternative is best, but we haven't seen it yet, and for all we can tell, this one's the best one on the table. And I think one of the things that we need to bear in mind here is that this is actually an argument that has to be made continuously, right? It's up to the supporters of the Constitution and defenders of the founding to explain persistently, relentlessly, but patiently and even cheerfully why our current system of government is better than any other idea that comes down the pike, right? And we think about this in the modern context of the last couple of years, right? I mean, people have complained a lot recently about the Electoral College. That, for instance, it's not fair that Wyoming gets three electors and that the state of California gets whatever it gets now, I think 52. It's not the Senate is not fair. Separation of powers unnecessarily slows down the functioning of the government. Federalism makes things more complicated than they need to be. What we need is an integrated system of government that empowers few people based upon a more democratic system to more effectively get things done. And there are merits to those arguments. I think we need to bear that in mind as well, that people who are frustrated with our system of government, oftentimes they make a good point. But I think one of the what we need to do, those of us who support and understand and appreciate the Constitution, is we need to not just wave those away, but we need to explain what the logic is. For instance, one of the things that I saw in the wake of the 2016 election, not the 2024 election, because Donald Trump won the majority of the he won a plurality of the popular vote, but in 2016, when he didn't, liberals complained, Democrats complained. They were upset, and they weren't necessarily wrong to be upset. I mean, the candidate that they wanted to win didn't win. And the reality is that that person won the most votes. And one of the things I saw a lot of conservatives, at least on the internet, I saw a lot of people respond, well, too bad. That's the way the rules are set up, which is, I suppose that's fine from a certain standpoint, from the standpoint of, winning a rhetorical point. But that hardly does justice to the logic of the Constitution. And it doesn't really work as a defense of the Constitution when we accept that the Constitution was not handed down by God, but it was created by individual men, and it was supposed to accomplish certain functions. So what we need to do then is not just say, well, tough luck. What we need to do is actually explain the logic of the Electoral College. And for instance, one of the things that when people would complain to me about that, and in my writing, one of the things that I would point out is that if you want a country that covers a vast geographical space, you have to make sure that you account for that space because space matters in politics. If you have, and I mean, the revolution itself is a perfect illustration of this. The Americans refused to be governed by a distant king and a foreign parliament that seemed to have no interest in their opinions or their viewpoints or their perspective on things, that wasn't going to meaningfully account for their views in the councils of government. And they rebelled. They didn't feel like they were included in a meaningful way. And that's really one thing that the Electoral College does, is it makes sure that more people are meaningfully included in the process of presidential selection. That's an important thing, especially in a country as large as ours, because if we were to have a pure straight up democracy, The popular vote would probably be determined by the, overwhelming portion of the country that lives on the Atlantic and the Pacific coasts. And the people who live in between would probably feel like their voice didn't matter. And in a republic, you secure legitimacy to the state by making sure that people feel like their voice matters, right? That's sort of part of that second idea of freedom that I talked about. It's not simply freedom from restraint by other individuals, but freedom to meaningfully participate in the lawmaking process. And to make sure that people can meaningfully participate in the lawmaking process, sometimes majority rule doesn't work all by itself. Sometimes it has to be supplemented. The Electoral College is a good example of that. Another good example of that would be the Senate. People complain about the Senate all the time. That, well, it's not fair that California only has two senators, the same number as Wyoming. The California Wyoming example is one that's always sort of brought up. And again, without sort of dismissing the frustration at that point, the practical issue is that the United States is a very large, diverse country that's spread out all over an entire continent. And if you want people to feel meaningfully that they can participate in the political process, you have to account for that geographic dispersion. And that's something that the Senate does. And so between the Senate and the House, you get this interesting compromise where population centers cannot dictate things to states, small states, but small states cannot dictate things to large population centers. They have to strike a compromise or a balance. These are examples of the sort of arguments that, to defend the Senate or to defend the Electoral College, it's not enough to just say, well, too bad, those are the rules. If you don't like it, move somewhere else, right? That's not the purpose of our constitutional system, right? And in fact, when, I would point out that, when the framers in Philadelphia had finished drafting the Constitution, they defended it. Madison and Jefferson, or excuse me, Madison and Hamilton, particularly took to the newspapers in New York City to defend and argue. Well, to the anti-federalist critics like Brutus or Federal Farmer or Sentinel said, this is what the Constitution does. And if you read the Federalist Papers, they're really sort of essay after essay, it's more like, no, that's not what the Constitution does. The Constitution does this thing instead, and this is why. That's what they were doing, right? In other words, like they were explaining and defending the logic of the Constitution and arguing that the logic of the Constitution makes sense. And that is something that we need to do today as Americans. And I think one of the really interesting things to think about, and sometimes it can be very frustrating to hear people complain about the Constitution. And as a conservative, as somebody who appreciates our political traditions, it can be frustrating. Part of me is like, well, people don't really appreciate these things for what they are. But part of me is also I enjoy it because I kind of feel like the great debate that the United States had in 1787, 1788 is actually still continuing. That this fight that we were having about our government still continues. It's still a conversation that is ongoing because, of course, we can change the Constitution anytime we want. And so, those of us who think that the Constitution works really well, we need to be able to defend it. Another thing we need to do, I think, another reason for this is that a lot of people will often complain about the Constitution, not fully realizing that the Constitution isn't the culprit, that it's actually been a choice that's been made by the government itself. And I'll give you an example of that. It actually relates to the Electoral College example I spoke about a moment ago. People will say, oh, well, the Electoral College is not fair. Wyoming gets one House seat or three electors. California gets 50, I don't know, was it 52, 53 at this point? That's not fair. Well, one of the reasons for that, and in fact, the main reason for that is that Congress, about 100 years ago, stopped adding House seats. As the population grew from the very beginning of the country until the early 20th century, after every census, they would add more House seats. They stopped doing that. Congress stopped adding House seats in the 19 teens, I think. So the House has been capped at 435 members, despite the fact that American population has basically tripled. Now, what that means in turn then is that if you think about it on a relative scale, Wyoming has gotten more political power as a consequence of that. Because if you allowed the number of House seats to increase, Wyoming would still stay at one, but California's numbers would go way, way up, right? So this sort of inequality in the electoral college, to the extent that it exists, is, yeah, sure, part of it is the Constitution. But part of it is not the Constitution. That has nothing to do with the Constitution at all. That was a choice that the House of Representatives made. And that's a choice that they continue to make. And by the way, it's a choice that they make, not because it's good for the country to have 435 House members. It's good for House members. House members, if more House members are added, their relative share of congressional power will decrease. So that's one reason. That's probably the main reason they don't add any more House seats. And other things as well. People talk about gerrymandering, things like that, or they talk about the winner take all factor in the electoral college. They blame the electoral college because, one candidate gets 51% of the vote and he gets all the electors in a state. Well, that's not in the Constitution either. Those decisions are left up to the state legislatures. And in fact, if you look at the earliest presidential contests, the earliest contested ones, in 1796, Virginia, Maryland split their electoral votes. In 1800, Pennsylvania split its electoral votes. So the notion that, this winner take all notion is not in the Constitution. There's all sorts of things like that. That people tend to blame the Constitution for, but are not actually in the Constitution. It's not the fault of the Constitution. It's not the fault of the founding. It's policy errors that have been made along the way, or policy decisions, political decisions about political process that were not, maybe that were not made for the best interests of the country, but for whatever narrow political interest that was extant at the time. There's all sorts of things like that. So the Constitution, in a lot of respects, it's not just that we need to defend it from bad reforms, but we need to defend it from unfair criticisms. And I think all of this means that if we're going to understand the Constitution, right, or if we're going to defend, I should say, if we're going to defend the Constitution, we have to understand it, which for me is awesome because I really like history. I was always really good at history when I was a kid, but history always sort of seemed like the most useless discipline for job prospects. They don't open history factories down the street, right? I just always thought it was fun, and I went off and pursued my passion. And it turns out this is actually a useful passion to have. The history of the founding. I think if you're watching this, you probably agree with me. It's really fun. You probably agree with me that it's intrinsically good, right? Because it's just an amazing event that is worth knowing for its own sake. It's not just important because it's instrumentally valuable to understand how our government should function, but is really part of like the continuing conversation about how to create a more perfect union, as the preamble to the Constitution says. That it's about what do we do to make this government work better. And those of us who are fans and defenders of the Constitution believe that the Constitution has demonstrated itself as a successful instrument of government, and that it should be given, it doesn't deserve blind loyalty, but it should be given the benefit of the doubt. And we should appreciate Franklin's idea that it's better than anything we've ever seen before, and it might be the best ever. Unfortunately, this is a big problem with our mediocre civics education in the public schools. Um, and it's very unfortunate, the development and the decline and fall of American civics education is very unfortunate, because civics education is really skills for citizenship. And in a republic such as ours, when we think about, okay, how does the government effectuate its will? In a free government, well, let me just say, like in a communist or fascist state, the government effectuates its will through the use of terror or the threat of force. Now, that exists in a free government as well. Obviously, if you're going 125 miles an hour down the highway, you should expect to get pulled over. So in other words, there's the use of force there, right? But in a free government, people follow the law for the most part because they believe the law is good. They believe that the regime is legitimate. And legitimacy in a free government depends on a shared understanding of how the system works and an agreement, a shared agreement that this is how it should work. And that's one of the problems with not only the failure to teach civics, but also the increasing extent to which the faults of America are emphasized above and beyond its virtues. Problematizing the founding is a very good thing. It's something that I'm in favor of. I'm a big fan of the warts and all picture of things. But increasingly, all that, is emphasized are the bad things, which really undermines this concept of legitimacy. If we're graduating and creating citizens who don't understand the government, how the government works, and think the government is terrible or shouldn't be working this way anyway, that's a danger in the long term. And so, I guess my final point here before we throw this over to questions is that as institutionalized public education has fallen short, we have to pursue informal modes, right? And I just don't mean like this podcast, but I mean all of us talking to other people and making the arguments with people, not being argumentative or not being, getting into fights, but just making the case in a cheerful, positive way. And providing information. Well, this is actually what they meant, and the reason it's not working this way is because of politicians today, not the founders. And we have to do this. We have to do this ourselves. Is what I'm getting at, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to start this podcast. It's one of the reasons why I'm at Grove City, the Institute for Faith and Freedom, and the American Enterprise Institute, because I think these are institutions that are really pointed in that direction of sort of, we need all of us need to come together, or not come together, but all of us need to focus on civics education with people in our day-to-day lives. And so that's really, I think, as I sort of close out the broadcast part of this, is really what I want to emphasize. So with that, Scott, that was about, a little more than 30 minutes, I think is how long we went. That's sort of my target moving forward here. I hope, my sort of feeling is that it's 7 o'clock on a Thursday night. The week's almost over. We're not going to go over long. Those of you on Twitter, assuming it's still working over there, who were fans of my previous podcast, Constitutionally Speaking, um, my podcast partner there and I would sometimes drone on for 3 hours. But I have my clock in front of me, and I'm going to keep this to like a tight 30 to 40 minutes. So I think I succeeded. So yeah. So with that, if we want to do some questions, people have questions. I would love to hear some questions. I'm trying to right now to figure out how this works on X, but if there's any questions in the chat room um, on Zoom, I'm more than happy to take some questions here. So let me see here. Right. Let's see. Let's see. Pulling down here. Okay. Let me see here. All right. Do you think, okay, so this is from the Institute for Faith and Freedom. Do you think there is any chance of reforming the official civic education in the United States? Um, no, not really. Unfortunately, I mean, I think one of the problems that we have nowadays is that public education, like a lot of government, has become extremely sclerotic, and it is not very good at responding to the needs and demands of society as it's continuing, to be perfectly honest. And so I think similar to what is going on in the university system. I think in a lot of respects, what we're increasingly going to be seeing is a move away from the old ways of doing things and just new institutions. So I think that's something that we're going to be seeing. Things that are sort of informal institutions. I would be surprised. I guess maybe the exception I would give for something like that in terms of education would be because education is a state-based phenomenon. I think that there are certain states moving in the direction of a more vigorous civic education. So it's probably say Florida would be one, probably Texas, Missouri, places like that. But even then, I think that the education establishment has been, I don't know if captured is too strong of a word, but suffice to say, I'm not a fan of the current education establishment in the United States, I would say. Yeah. Let's see here. All right. Let's see. I'm just sort of looking to see if I can find anything on X. I don't, honestly, I don't, I've never done this before, so I have no idea. Let's see here. Let's click on library here. Um, okay. I'm not seeing anything there. Other question. Anybody else have any other questions? I think one of the things I'm probably going to be talking about next week, if you're interested, is we're going to be sort of looking at some of the intellectual origins of the American founding. We're going to be looking at the extent to which the Americans relied upon the political traditions in ancient Rome and the political tradition of Great Britain, and also the social context of the United States at the time as well, which was a really remarkable. The Americans were really remarkable in that extent, the extent to which they had um, a tradition of independent self-governance that just sort of happened because they were left alone, and that's just how they took things as the way they should be. So we'll be talking about that too. So, all right. All right. If there are no other questions, I think we'll call this a day here. And thank you very much, everybody, for listening. Those of you who listened on X, thanks as well. I hope the broadcast was a success. Honestly, I have no idea if it was or wasn't, but yeah, thanks very much, everybody. I'll see you next week.